The auditorium was buzzing, a restless energy humming through every row of chairs. Cameras pointed like arrows at the stage, their red lights blinking, as if they too were waiting for something explosive. Then it happened. Candace Owens, face tightened with fury, leaned into the microphone and let out a scream that cut through the hall like glass shattering on marble. The words themselves mattered less than the venom in her voice. It was a detonation. Gasps broke out instantly. Some in the crowd laughed nervously, others shook their heads. In a pocket of her supporters erupted in cheer, feeding off the chaos. The spotlight seemed to burn hotter, brighter, locking everyone in place. For a few seconds, the air itself felt like it couldn't move, as if the entire room was holding its breath. This was more than political theater. This was rage weaponized, spectacle packaged as dominance. Candace thrived in this space, louder, sharper, more combustible than anyone else. Her scream wasn't just directed at Jasmine Crockett. It was aimed at every value Jasmine stood for: calmness, dignity, truth, and an unwavering commitment to community. Candace wanted the noise too, drown all of that out, but the scream carried a strange consequence. As it ricocheted across the hall, echoing against walls lined with history and expectation, it began to sound less like power and more like desperation. Some in the audience exchanged glances that said it all. Had she gone too far? And then almost imperceptibly, the energy shifted. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't even blink. Instead, she sat there in the glare of the same unforgiving lights, her posture unshaken, her eyes steady. It was the silence after the storm that made the crowd lean in. If Candace's scream was meant to dominate, Jasmine's composure was about to redefine the moment entirely. No one knew it yet, but this was the calm before a reply so sharp, so disciplined, that it would ignite something far bigger than this stage. Clips of what happened next would race across timelines. Hashtags would explode, and pundits would scramble to frame the fallout. What began as a scream would end as a seismic shift, and as the echo of Candace's voice faded, the question hung. In the air, how do you answer rage without raising your own voice? Because Jasmine was about to show them all. The stage itself was a battlefield, dressed as a forum. Bright white lights poured down like judgment, exposing every flicker of expression, every tremor in a voice. Behind the podiums, names gleamed. In bold letters, symbols of more than just individuals, they were banners of two visions for America colliding in real time. The event had been billed as a debate on policy, but everyone in that room, and everyone watching through the glare of a live stream, knew it was about much more. It was about race, about gender, about whose voice carried weight in a space historically dominated by power and privilege. It was about whether rage and volume could still drown out truth, or whether composure and clarity could finally carve through the noise. Candace Owens embodied a brash confrontational style that had made her both adored and despised. Jasmine Crockett stood as her opposite, a quiet storm shaped by years in courtrooms and on the House floor, sharpened not by anger, but by purpose. The stakes were impossible to ignore. For Candace, this was a chance to reaffirm her brand of provocation, to claim dominance in front of cameras that would replay her every word. For Jasmine, it was more than survival. It was an opportunity to represent millions who had been told their calm, their dignity, their identity were weaknesses in a world that rewards loudness over truth. Every sentence carried the weight of history immigrant stories, civil rights, battles, generational wounds still tender to the touch. The audience reflected the divide. On one side, cheers erupted at Candace's outbursts, fists pumped in the air as if volume itself was victory. On the other, silence sharpened into resolve. With nods of quiet support for Jasmine's measured presence, you could feel the tension stretch across the rows like a fault line, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Commentators scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Cameras zoomed tighter on Jasmine's face, hoping to capture a wince, a crack. Anything that might suggest the scream had worked. But she gave them nothing. The restraint only deepened the suspense, the crowd leaning in, sensing that something was about to break. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was theater, morality, play referendum. The confrontation captured the broader question simmering in the nation. Will arrogance and spectacle define the stage? Will patience and dignity carve out a new model of leadership? Candace, flushed from the adrenaline of her scream, seemed convinced she had already seized control. She paced slightly, her energy erratic, savoring the reactions she had provoked. But her eyes darted toward Jasmine, almost searching, almost daring her opponent to rise to the bait. Jasmine, still silent, adjusted the microphone as if preparing for the weight of history itself. The room waited. The silence between them stretched, long enough to make the air heavy. And in that silence, an unsettling realization spread. Perhaps Candace's roar wasn't the climax, but merely the prelude, because Candace wasn't finished. She would push even harder, louder, sharper, unaware that the next escalation would not only fail to silence Jasmine, but would set the stage for a reply destined to outlive the noise of that scream. Candace Owens did not stumble into notoriety. She built it brick by brick, controversy by controversy, until her name itself became shorthand for conflict. She was never the type to slip quietly into a conversation. From the moment she entered public life, her weapon was volume, and her currency was outrage. Some called her fearless, others called her reckless. But no one denied her talent for turning sparks into wildfires. Her rise began with sharp monologues that cut through political spaces like daggers. She was quick, witty, and merciless. The kind of debater who didn't just aim to win an argument but to scorch the earth beneath her opponent's feet. Clips of her confrontations went viral not because of the content of her arguments, but because of the theater she delivered. She didn't speak to persuade. She spoke to dominate, but domination has its cost. For every cheer she earned from a conservative crowd, she left behind a trail of contradictions. She had once criticized the very movements she later courted. She had railed against hypocrisy while standing knee-deep in her own. She fashioned herself as a truth-teller, yet her truths shifted depending on the stage she stood on. Her critics didn't have to dig deep. Her words contradicted themselves often enough to stand as their own indictment. Still, she thrived. Outrage became her oxygen. She knew that in the age of social media, attention was more powerful than consistency. Every viral moment bought her another platform, another headline, another invitation to spar. She relished it. The more her opponents winced, the more her supporters cheered. Candace had mastered the art of playing the villain, a role she not only accepted but wore proudly. Knowing villains command the spotlight, her arrogance was her armor. On stage, she dismissed her adversaries with smirks, rolled eyes, and sharp quips designed not to engage but to belittle. She made her opponents look small by sheer force of personality, and in many cases, it worked. Few could withstand the storm of her interruptions, her booming voice, her ability to drown logic and noise. She didn't debate. Yet, beneath the bravado was an unmistakable pattern. Chaos followed her. Every stage she graced turned into a theater of provocation. Every microphone she touched became a conduit for conflict. For years, chaos was her ally. She built a career out of being unshakable in her aggression, untouchable in her fire. But chaos has a natural predator: composure. For all the times Candace shouted her way to headlines, there lingered an untested question: what happens when someone refuses to meet her volume with volume? When her storm collides with a stillness so steady it cannot be moved? That was the unspoken tension building in the auditorium. Candace had brought her arsenal, the same tactics that had carried her through countless appearances. She screamed. She ridiculed. She pressed forward with the force of a fighter who only knows one strategy: to overwhelm. But Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary opponent. She had weathered louder storms in courtrooms and more insidious attacks in the halls of Congress. She didn't need to shout to command attention. Candace had always thrived when she set the terms, when she framed the conflict on her turf. Yet, in this moment, under these lights, her familiar strategy was beginning to falter. Each scream, each dismissal, each sarcastic laugh seemed to echo back, not as dominance, but as desperation. She was fighting an invisible opponent, the very idea that calm could be stronger than rage, Her supporters, loud as ever, mistook the noise for victory. They cheered as if the volume alone meant Candace was winning. But something else was stirring. In the silence on the other side of the room, something subtler, something more enduring. Because for the first time, Candace Owens wasn't just up against another opponent eager to trade fire with fire. She was up against someone who understood the power of restraint. And as history has shown time and again, villains thrive on chaos until the day they meet someone who refuses to play their game. Candace had built a career on making others unravel. What she didn't realize in that charged moment on stage was that her unraveling had already begun. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin on a stage. It begins in the long hours of law school libraries, in the dimly lit offices of legal aid clinics, in the quiet but relentless grind of someone who understood early on that life would never hand her a microphone. If Candace Owens built her reputation on spectacle, Jasmine Crockett built hers on substance. Her journey was not about commanding headlines. It was about commanding justice. As a young lawyer, Jasmine chose cases others shied away from. She represented the people who couldn't afford polished firms or well-connected advocates, tenants facing eviction, families crushed by predatory lending, young men and women pulled into a justice system that seemed designed to swallow them whole. She walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked and still found a way to tilt the scales toward fairness. For her, the law wasn't abstract, it was survival. Every victory she earned carried scars. Judges questioned her judgment. Opposing counsel underestimated her. Clients came to her not with hope, but with desperation. And yet through all of it, she carried herself with a steadiness that became her trademark. When tempers flared, Jasmine steadied the room. When voices rose, hers stayed calm, cutting sharper for its composure. That composure was not born of privilege, it was forged in fire. As a black woman in law and politics, she faced the sneers, the dismissals, the coded language meant to undermine her authority. She had been told she was too young, too emotional, too unseasoned, more times than she could count. But each dismissal was a stone in the foundation she built, proof that her presence in those spaces mattered. Instead of shrinking, she doubled down. She studied harder, spoke clearer, prepared longer. Where others relied on volume, Jasmine relied on precision. Her path to Congress was not smooth, but it was steady. She earned her seat not through theatrics, but through organizing, through listening, through showing up in communities that had long been overlooked. She knocked on doors, sat in kitchens, listened to stories that echoed her own. When she finally took her oath of office, she carried those voices with her, the single mothers balancing two jobs, the veterans navigating broken systems, the young activists demanding that their futures not be bartered away. Jasmine knew what it meant to be underestimated. She knew what it meant to fight battles not for glory, but because someone had to. And she knew that dignity was not weakness, no matter how many times opponents tried to spin it that way. Her calm was not passivity, it was a weapon honed over years of being tested, disrespected, and doubted. Where others mistook silence for surrender, Jasmine understood that silence could be strategy. That understanding gave her a different kind of power. In committee hearings, when others shouted over one another, she let them tire themselves out before delivering a line so sharp it left the room frozen. In interviews, when pressed with hostile questions, she answered with clarity that turned the question back on the asker. In debates, she knew that the moment her opponent lost control, she had already won. Her supporters saw her as more than a politician. They saw her as proof. Proof that you could stand in your identity and not apologize for it. Proof that you didn't have to scream to be heard. Proof that dignity, patience, preparation were not relics of the past, but the tools of a new kind of leadership. And yet, beneath the calm, Jasmine carried a fire. Not the kind that burns recklessly, but the kind that sustains, quiet, steady, unstoppable. She knew the weight of history, knew that every time she took the mic, she spoke not only for herself, but for generations who had been silenced before her. That responsibility did not rattle her. It anchored her. It was this blend of calm and fire that would prepare her. The clash with Candace Owens. The years in courtrooms where she faced down bias. The hours spent defending voices no one else wanted to hear. The long, grinding work of building a reputation not from spectacle but from substance. All of it sharpened her into someone uniquely suited for a moment when arrogance would collide with dignity. Because while Candace brought volume, Jasmine brought history. While Candace leaned on spectacle, Jasmine leaned on substance. And when those two forces met on stage, it would not be the scream that defined the night, it would be the calm reply that cut deeper than any outburst could. In this experience, every scar and every triumph would prepare her for the moment of truth. The scream was only the beginning. Candace, emboldened by the reaction it drew, pressed forward with sharper edges. Her words came fast, spit out like bullets, each one aimed not at policy but at personality. She ridiculed Jasmine's experience, dismissed her record, mocked her tone. Her voice climbed higher with every line, the rhythm of someone less interested in dialogue than in domination. The stage became her battlefield, and she wielded insults like weapons. The crowd responded unevenly. A section of Candace's supporters erupted with applause at each jab, cheering as though cruelty were a sport. But across the hall, others shifted in their seats. Some folded their arms, others shook their heads. A ripple of unease spread through the audience what had started. As the debate was veering into something uglier, more personal, the atmosphere thickened, the tension almost visible. Like heat rising from asphalt, Candace's body language matched her words. She leaned forward over the podium, jabbing the air with her finger, her tone carrying a sharpness meant to slice. The microphone trembled with her volume. She was no longer just addressing Jasmine. She was performing for the cameras, for the clips she knew would be cut and shared online. The louder she grew, the more she seemed to believe she was winning. Jasmine, however, remained still. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her eyes didn't dart nervously. She listened, her expression unreadable, her breathing measured. The contrast was almost theatrical. On one side, fire and fury. On the other, water and stone. Candace's energy filled the room with chaos, but Jasmine's steadiness seemed to anchor it. Keeping the storm from sweeping everyone away, commentators seated near the front exchanged glances, sensing the narrative unfolding. They scribbled notes, underlining words like anger, attack, and composure. For them, clash was more than a spectacle. It was a test of which archetype would resonate: the loud fighter who claimed space by force, or the calm leader who let restraint speak louder than rage. The audience leaned into the contrast. Insult hurled by Candace made Jasmine's silence more powerful. The longer Jasmine refused to react, the more the crowd anticipated what would come when she finally did. It was tension not unlike a courtroom before a closing argument. The air so tight with expectation that even the smallest movement could send a jolt through the room. Candace sensed it too. Her words grew even more personal, stretching beyond politics into character assassination. She laughed dismissively at Jasmine's background, sneered at her credentials, and belittled her supporters. It was in a loud attempt to rattle, to break composure, to force Jasmine into a response that would validate the aggression. But Jasmine didn't move. Her calmness was no longer just composure, it was defiance. By now the room was divided. Some clapped loudly, determined to keep Candace's energy alive. Others sat in quiet solidarity with Jasmine, waiting. The silence of her supporters was not weakness. It was patience, a trust that when she did speak, her words would not need volume to be heard. Candace ended her tirade with a smirk, certain she had cornered her opponent. The applause from her side rang out, but it was thinner now, edged with a nervousness no one wanted to name. The tension was unbearable, a taut string ready to snap. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Jasmine shifted. Her hand adjusting the microphone, her gaze steady, unshaken. The small movement alone sent a ripple through the crowd. Every eye turned. Every breath caught. The storm of noise was about to meet its answer. And then, Jasmine leaned into the mic. The crowd braced itself. Jasmine's hand rested lightly on the microphone, her fingers steady, her breath even. The silence that followed Candace's tirade stretched across the hall, tense and electric. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink into the space between the two women, the aggressor still brimming with energy, the defender composed and unreadable. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice carried not the force of a shout, but the weight of authority. "Are you finished?" she asked softly. The words, delivered without anger, landed heavier than any scream. The audience gasped, the kind of collective intake of breath that signals a shift in power. Candace smirked, dismissive, but her fingers gripped the edge of the podium just a little tighter. Jasmine continued, her cadence deliberate, her pauses stretched just enough to build suspense. "You've called me names," she said, her tone calm, measured. "You've dismissed my work, my record, my identity. Haven't done what you cannot do, is erase the truth of why I stand here. I stand here because I've fought for people this country too often ignores. I stand here because my voice is not just my own, it carries the weight of communities you'd rather shout over than hear." A murmur rippled through the audience. Heads nodded. Some clapped lightly before the room settled back into silence, hungry for the next line. Jasmine let the quiet linger before pressing on. "You think that volume makes you strong? That anger makes you powerful. But history tells a different story. History belongs to those who stay steady when others lose control. It belongs to those who answer arrogance with dignity. It belongs to those who understand that leadership isn't about who screams the loudest. It's about who speaks the truth when the room finally grows quiet." Candace shifted, her earlier bravado faltering. She tried to interject, but Jasmine raised her hand slightly, not with force, but with finality. The room responded instantly, hushing Candace before Jasmine even had to. "And let me be clear," Jasmine said, her tone sharpening like a blade. "I will not be shouted down, not by you, not by anyone, because every time you scream at me, you're not just screaming at Jasmine Crockett. You're screaming at every woman who's been told to sit down. You're screaming at every immigrant family who's been told they don't belong. You're screaming at every young person who's been told their voice doesn't matter. My answer to all of them is the same. Dignity will outlast your noise." The hall erupted first with gasps, then with applause that rolled like thunder. Across the rows, cameras flashed, recording what was already becoming a moment destined for replay. Candace's smile stiffened, her laugh forced. As though trying to shake off the shift, she could feel tightening around her. Jasmine didn't press the advantage with gloating. Instead, she let the applause crest and fall before delivering her final blow with a softness that made it sting all the more. "You can scream at me all you want," she said. "But the louder you get, the clearer it becomes that you're not fighting me. You're fighting the truth, and that's a fight you cannot win." The words landed like a gavel. Candace's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her tongue caught between a retort and the realization that nothing she said now would erase the silence that followed Jasmine's words. Her body language betrayed her shifting weight, eyes darting, hands fidgeting. She looked less like a victor and more like someone suddenly aware the ground beneath her had shifted. Meanwhile, the audience reaction spread like fire. People stood, clapping, cheering. Phones shot into the air, capturing every second. On social media, clips began to circulate instantly. Hashtags blooming. Hashtag.com crushes chaos. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag dignity over noise. In real time, the narrative was being written, and Candace was not the author. The longer Jasmine remained poised, the more Candace seemed to unravel. She tried to interject again, her voice louder this time, but the crowd drowned her out with applause. The stage that once bent to her energy now resisted her, every attempt at control slipping through her fingers. For years, chaos had been her weapon. But tonight, composure had disarmed her completely, and Jasmine, sensing the shift, let the moment breathe. She didn't rush. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, calm as ever, letting the cheers roll over her like a tide, letting silence follow her words like an exclamation point. This was not just a rebuttal. It was a reversal. In a single reply, Jasmine Crockett had reframed the entire exchange. turning Candace's scream into the backdrop for a lesson in dignity. She hadn't just answered the attack, she had transformed it into a moral spectacle, one that the audience would carry with them long after the lights dimmed. And what happened next ensured this moment. It started before the debate even ended. As the audience still clapped and cheered, phones were already uploading clips, captions, and instant reactions. Within minutes, the first tweets were live. Short, punchy declarations Candace got. Cooked, Jasmine stayed calm and killed it. This is how you end arrogance. By the time the moderator tried to regain control of the stage, hashtags had already taken shape. Hashtag Crockett mic drop surged, followed closely by hashtag dignity over noise. And hashtag.com crushes chaos. On Instagram, reels of Jasmine's reply hit 1 million views in under an hour. TikTok edits stitched together her soft-spoken retort against Candace's red-faced shouting, overlaid with dramatic music. Memes spread like wildfire. Candace's open-mouthed scream captioned when Wi-Fi drops for 3 seconds, side by side, with Jasmine's steady gaze labeled that one friend who never loses their cool. Humor became the vehicle for truth. And the truth was clear. Candace's chaos had been eclipsed. Mainstream commentators pounced quickly. Liberal outlets framed it as a generational clash. Composure defeats chaos on national stage. Progressive voices elevated Jasmine as a symbol of resilience, while conservative pundits scrambled to reframe the exchange as passion versus political correctness. But even those defenses felt hollow, drowned by the sheer volume of viral applause. Celebrities chimed in. Actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the clip with fire emojis and words like iconic. A-list comedians turned it into late-night fodder, replaying Candace's outburst and Jasmine's calm reply for laughs, the timing perfect for a punchline. Even politicians across the aisle took notice. Some Democrats praised Jasmine publicly, while a handful of Republicans, careful not to alienate their base, acknowledged her composure without naming Candace. The contrast was unmistakable. In an age of political theater, Jasmine had delivered a performance of grace under fire that audiences craved. For Candace, the internet was less forgiving. Screenshots of her scowl turned into endless memes. Her shout became the soundtrack for remixes and joke edits, paired with captions like "when you lose an argument but won't admit it." The louder she had been in the moment, the louder the mockery became after. Social media doesn't forget in this case. It didn't forgive either. But for Jasmine, the effect was seismic. Supporters didn't just celebrate her, they claimed her. For Black women, her calm rebuttal was validation of years spent forced to respond to disrespect with composure. For immigrants, her words carried the resonance of belonging. For young activists, it was proof that truth, delivered with dignity, could still dominate the loudest noise. Across platforms, people called her the voice we need, the example we've been waiting for. She wasn't just a congresswoman. Anymore, she was a cultural touchstone, and the ripples extended beyond memes and retweets. Editorial boards ran up heads about the Crockett model of political discourse. Activists cited her reply in speeches. High school debate coaches showed the clip to students as a masterclass in rhetoric. What had begun as a heated exchange between two women on a stage had become something larger, a blueprint for how to meet arrogance with poise. Hostility with humanity. The shockwaves reached far into communities tired of noise-driven politics. People who usually tuned out debates shared Jasmine's clip with captions like, "This is why I still believe." It was more than a viral moment. It was a reminder that politics didn't have to be about who could yell the loudest. It could be about clarity, conviction, and truth. Candace had sought to dominate the stage with volume. Instead, Jasmine transformed the confrontation into a turning point, one where the rules of engagement seemed to shift before everyone's eyes. And as the applause rolled on across the internet, one question lingered. If dignity could silence arrogance in one debate, what else could it change? Because what happened that night wasn't just about two women. It was about the future of political discourse. It was about who would shape the narrative moving forward, those who shouted, or those who spoke with purpose. And as the hashtags climbed into trending lists worldwide, it became undeniable. This was no longer just a debate moment. It was a cultural marker, one destined to echo far beyond the stage lights. In the end, the scream faded. What lingered was not the noise, but the silence that followed, the silence Jasmine owned with her measured words. That silence carried more weight than the loudest insult. It was the moment the audience, the country, and anyone watching online realized a deeper truth. Dignity speaks louder than rage ever could. Jasmine's reply was not just a rebuttal. It was a reframing, where Candace sought to drag the debate into personal attacks and shouting matches. Jasmine elevated it into a conversation about values, who we are, what we stand for, and what kind of America we choose to believe in. She didn't meet rage with rage. She met it with composure. She didn't counter noise with more noise. She countered it with truth. In that single act, she transformed the stage from a spectacle into a statement. And people felt it. The audience didn't just witness a congresswoman answering a critic. They saw themselves reflected in her response. For every immigrant who had ever been told they didn't belong, Jasmine's calm presence said, "You do." For every woman who had been shouted over in a boardroom or belittled on a stage, her unshaken voice said, "Stand tall." For every young activist who feared their truth would be drowned out by louder forces, her words carried the promise that courage could hold the line. That was the deeper victory of the night. It wasn't just that Candace was silenced, it was that Jasmine gave others permission to believe that composure and clarity could still cut through the noise of an age defined by outrage. She became proof that politics could be more than theater. It could be a space where truth, spoken softly, could roar. This was bigger than Candace, bigger than one debate. It became a mirror held up to America itself. On one side, a politics of provocation, loud, angry, divisive. On the other, a politics of dignity, grounded, unflinching, quietly powerful. Jasmine embodied the latter, and in doing so, she reminded the country that identity is not a weapon but a strength, and that true courage isn't about who can scream the loudest, but who can stand calm in the storm. The emotional crescendo rippled outward. Audiences who had laughed at the memes or cheered the clapback began to feel something more lasting, inspiration. They weren't just entertained, they were moved. And that movement carried a simple but transformative lesson. Dignity is not weakness. Calm is not surrender. Truth, when spoken with conviction, can silence even the fiercest chaos. It was a moment destined to be replayed in classrooms, living rooms, and community halls, because it distilled a truth Americans are hungry to remember: that progress doesn't come from rage, but from resilience. That identity isn't something to be shouted down, but something to be carried with pride. And that when the noise of arrogance fills the air, the clearest response is often the calmest one. In that silence after the scream, a new kind of power revealed itself. A power rooted in composure, in history, in the sacrifices of those who came before, and the dreams of those yet to come. A power that told the world, rage burns fast, but dignity endures. And as the echoes of that night continue to roll across timelines and television screens, one truth remains unshakable. What Jasmine gave the country was more than a response. It was a reminder. A reminder that in the clash between noise and truth, it is dignity that leaves the lasting mark. Candace may have screamed, her voice echoing through the hall like a thunderclap meant to intimidate. But it wasn't the scream that history remembered. It was Jasmine, the congresswoman, who stayed calm, leaned into the mic, and delivered words so precise, so steady, that the entire crowd froze. She didn't need volume. She didn't need theatrics. She stunned the room with nothing more than composure and truth. That's the real story of the night. Not rage, not arrogance, not the desperate need to dominate, but the quiet strength of dignity. Candace embodied the politics of noise, of provocation for its own sake. Jasmine embodied something different, the politics of clarity, of self-respect, of conviction that refuses to bend even under fire. In a world where shouting often drowns out listening, her response was a revelation. It reminded us that arrogance can win the moment, but it cannot win the heart. Only dignity does that. And in the silence after her reply, We saw it for ourselves. Chaos had been silenced. Not by force, but by calm. This is why her words matter beyond one stage, one debate, one night. They matter because they show us a way forward, a way to believe again in truth delivered with grace. They remind us that composure isn't weakness, it's strength. It's refined by struggle. If you believe composure will always silence chaos, share this story. If you believe dignity is stronger than arrogance, subscribe. And join us. Join the movement of voices rewriting history, one calm truth at a time. Because in the end, the scream will be forgotten, but the calm will echo,